Hello and welcome to this lecture on the Great Depression. In this lecture, we will talk about the events that led to the Great Depression, the initial years of the Great Depression, and the Hoover administration's attempt to respond to the Great Depression. Let's begin. On October 29th, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed, and this is traditionally seen as the start of the Great Depression. But as any economist or historian of the period will tell you, it did not cause the Great Depression. Stock markets are never great indicators of the overall health or problems within the economy. Stock markets are indicators of their own kinds of things. They're certainly part of the economy, but they certainly don't indicate whether an economy is healthy or has problems or anywhere in between. So even though October 29th, 1929 and the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange is seen as the traditional starting day of the Great Depression, its origins are much more complicated and asks us to think a little bit about the economic conditions and legacy of the 1920s. And so that's what we need to explore for a little bit. The 1920s is often called the Roaring Twenties. It's seen as a period of unparalleled economic growth in American history. And if you look at just the overall economy, it is clear that the 1920s represents real growth in the United States, real and true economic growth in the United States. During the 1920s, the United States becomes the economic juggernaut of the world. We are the world's factory. We are the world's largest economy. We have surpassed the other industrial economies like Great Britain and Germany and other European powers. We have surpassed the economy of Japan, even though Japan has a very strong economy in the 1920s. We are the world's largest economy, and we have been ever since. However, the economic growth in the 1920s that led to this tremendous creation of wealth in the United States, it wasn't without its problems. And it is in these problems that we can see the origins of the Great Depression. And so most economists and historians see four major causes of the Great Depression embedded during the economic growth and situation of the 1920s. I'm going to go through these just for a little bit. So the first is a lack of economic diversity. Economies, when you're looking at an economy, economists are very good at measuring the total economic production and total economic wealth generated by an economy. But just because we can, and just because when economists do that, so when economists look at an economy and say, well, overall, the economy is growing by X amount, and it's generating so much wealth, and it's this productive. Those are overall measures of the totality of the economy. But just because an economy is growing doesn't necessarily make it a healthy economy. And economic growth can mask systemic economic problems. And one of the first things we want to talk about that the 1920s economy, one of the features and characteristics of the 1920s economy was a lack of economic diversity. So during the 1920s, the economy overall grew, but it didn't grow for every economic sector. Agriculture found itself in decline for most of the 1920s. So the production of crops for food or industrial use found itself in decline during the 1920s. So the agriculture economy was not doing well, or at least most of it wasn't doing well, in the 1920s. Similarly, resource-based industries struggled during the 1920s, be it fishing or mining or logging. Many of these industries struggled in the 1920s. What was really growing in the 1920s was the industrial economy. So what was really growing in the 1920s was the industrial economy. And it was growing to such an extent that it was masking systemic problems with other economic industries. It was growing to such an extent that most people didn't realize that there were other sections of the economy and parts of the country that were not doing well during the 1920s. In fact, the 1920s economic growth was mostly localized to industrial centers like New York City or Chicago or Detroit, cities that were industrial production centers. Outside of those areas, the economy wasn't growing that much. But it was the industrial economy that was growing. Now you can break the industrial economy into two different types. There's light industry and heavy industry. And light industry are like consumer goods. Think clothing, shoes, anything that consumers might use. And heavy industry are things like machines and steel and ships and things like that. With respect to industry, both light and heavy industry were doing well for the first part of the 1920s, say through 1924, 1925. But after 1925, light industry began to taper off and enter a little bit of a decline. The reason for that is light industry was booming, selling to Europe because the European economy had been devastated during World War I. And then light industry had been selling around the world with no competition, for the most part, from European economies. But after 1925, most European countries recovered from World War I, at least economically speaking, and that meant that they no longer were dependent on the United States for light industry goods, and they could compete with the United States abroad in areas of light industry. That meant from 1925-26 on, the only real economic industry growing in the United States was heavy industry, things like steel and ships and machines, things that were things of that nature. And heavy industry was doing really, really, really well until the end of 1928, start of 1929. So by 1929, all of the indicators were there that the economy was set to decline and experience setbacks. And what we really saw was that the economy of the United States had been driven by a handful of industries, and when those industries started to fall off in 1929, then you get the depression itself. So lack of economic diversity. Had more of the economy been doing well, then the depression itself might have been avoidable. The second big problem in the economy in the 1920s was the wealth gap. The tremendous wealth generated in the 1920s was not distributed evenly across the United States. In fact, it was concentrated in the hands of a few families and a few corporations. Even though the 1920s represents an enormous period of economic growth, that growth was reserved for only a handful of people in any profound and significant way. 50% of all Americans in 1929 lived at, just above, or just below the poverty line. They lived at, just above, or just below the poverty line. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean by that is the poverty line is this term that economists and historians and sociologists and political scientists use to describe the amount of money people need to cover their basic costs. So if you live at the poverty line, it means all the money you earn goes to housing, food, clothing, and other basic necessities. You have nothing left over to save. You have nothing left over to spend on consumer items or just things that you want, or to save in case times get tough. If you live at the poverty line, everything you spend goes to cover your basic costs. You really have no wealth. If you live just below the poverty line, well, that means that you are having to forego something. You are choosing to not fulfill all your basic needs because you can't afford it. So you're picking and choosing. Either your housing situation isn't great, or you're skipping meals because you can't afford all the food that you need or want, or you're not buying clothing, or some combination thereof. And if you're just above the poverty line, well, you can afford everything and you have a little left over, but it isn't much. That describes half of all Americans. They either lived at, just above, or just below the poverty line. Why this is important is for two reasons. When the Depression hits, these people do not have savings or wealth that would allow them to weather the effects of the Depression, the loss of jobs, and the lack of job opportunities. But the second reason this is very important is that America lives in a consumer economy. America was a consumer economy at the time. Industrial economies are consumer economies. For industrial economies to grow, you need consumers to buy industrial goods. Industrial goods are goods that are mass produced. When you don't have the vast majority of your population who have disposable income, they cannot afford their basic goods, then when hard times hit, they do not have the ability to purchase money to drive demand in the economy. Wealthy people only need so many cars, so many homes, so many pieces of furniture, so many shoes, so many pieces of jewelry, so much of every kind of imaginable consumer good. So no matter how much money you make, there's a limit to how much of that stuff you're going to buy. For a healthy economy, you want a population that has money in their hands so they can continue to buy to drive consumption. The wealth gap meant that there wasn't enough money in the hands of your average American who would be consumers. So not only did the wealth gap contribute to the Depression in causing it, it made the Depression worse once it set on. The third thing that most economists and historians see as a major cause of the Great Depression is the debt situation. Debt is a facet of industrial economies, and that in of itself is not bad. In an industrial economy, you often need more money to engage in an activity than you actually have. Be that money that you need to borrow to start a factory, or if you're just an average person, pardon me, if you're just an average person, you might want to buy a house or a car, but you can't afford to buy a house or a car just with the money you've saved because you couldn't save enough money. But if you were to borrow the money from the bank, you could buy the car, buy the home, and then make payments that was reasonable. So debt can be a positive thing, and debt is always related to banking. The problem that happened in the 1920s is that banks had been engaging in risky activities. They had been engaging in risking loan and lending practices, particularly with putting money in the stock market, but also with some of the loans that they were willing to make. And so when the Depression hits, you have a twofold problem. Problem number one is that when the stock market crashes, banks end up losing a lot of money because they're what are called over-leveraged. And over-leveraged means that they put too much money in the stock market. Banks have put too much money in the stock market. They have too much debt tied up in the stock market. So when the stock market collapses, the banks lose a bunch of money. And then that becomes a problem in a variety of ways. Number one, banks are the repository and the depository of consumers' money. Consumers put their money in the bank because they think it's safer than just having it at home, and they can maybe earn a little interest on savings, and working with a bank then allows the bank to give you a loan when you need it. But the banks always loan out someone else's money. That's just how it works. Banks always loan out someone else's money. And so what happens is that the banks were loaning out the money that were their deposits. And when they lost that money, they didn't have enough money to cover their deposits. Meaning, when people went to the bank to get their money out because they lost their jobs or they lost their business and they needed to make some payments, they went to the bank and the bank said, sorry, we don't have your money. And once it found out that banks were running out of money, there was a massive run on the banks across the country, which people were panicked, running to the bank trying to get their money out because they'd heard that other banks had failed and people had lost all their savings that they had in that bank. This run on the banks then meant that the banks across the country began to close because they simply didn't have any money to cover their costs. And that became a further problem because banks provide the necessary capital in an industrial economy to do business. And so without the banks having capital, money to loan out, they couldn't help businesses save their homes, save their industries, save their factories, and individuals save their homes and save their cars. The other thing that happened is that banks began to call in debts. So when the banks lost their money in the stock market, they began to call in loans, call in auto loans, meaning that they told the person, hey, your loan is due today, all of it, pay it or we take your car. They did the same thing on home loans. They did the same thing on business loans. And that caused even more economic hardship. So you had a debt situation with the banks that was unsustainable. And once the stock market crashed, it created a domino effect that had real suffering in the economy as a whole. The fourth thing is the international situation. By the 1920s, we were in a globally interconnected economy. We're in an economy in which the United States is dependent on other countries, and other countries are dependent on the United States. It's an economy of interconnectedness, of interdependencies. Today, we call this like globalism, right? In which economies are often intertwined with one another, and we act like it's new to the era that we live in. But the reality is that it's not new. It is simply, it's been going on for a long time, and it was very true in the 1920s. So what this means is all the economies, or most of the world's economies, are kind of intertwined. And so when the United States goes into depression, it drags much of the Western world with it. And in doing so, it basically, the United States becomes the world's largest economy. It collapsed and it dragged the rest of the world into economic depression because no other economy could grow in a way that could help the United States grow. So these events combined create the Great Depression, and the impact of the Great Depression was immediate. High unemployment, reaching as high as 25% by 1931-32. The banking industry collapses. There's widespread poverty because there are no jobs and because people's savings were wiped out, and because they didn't have much savings to begin with. And there's widespread homelessness as people lost their homes either to the banks or because they couldn't pay their mortgages or their rent. Whatever the case is, it just means things get tough. If you look at the conditions of the Great Depression, you can see it brings a staggering amount of economic and social suffering, widespread unemployment, and unemployment was at times 25%. That 25% number it's a hard number to get a handle on because that largely represents the white male population of the economy. We know that unemployment was much higher for immigrant communities and African American communities. We also know that women were not encouraged to work in the workforce during the 1920s, but during the Great Depression, women have to contribute to the family income like anyone else because there's such widespread need. And so unemployment was probably much higher than 25% at various times during the Great Depression. But unemployment is a real problem. And what you see is people desperate for new opportunities and migrating around the country in search of new opportunities. So you get migrations from rural to urban settings because the depression is really bad all over the country, but it's particularly bad for rural communities where there are almost no opportunities. So people in rural communities, especially farmers, decide, well, things are so bad here, I'll go to the city and try to find a factory job. So cities become like magnets for poor from the countryside, but of course the economy is equally bad in urban settings. And so massive homelessness and poverty emerges in these cities. And what happens is that all over the country, you get these makeshift tent cities, these shanty towns, in which people are living in temporary buildings constructed of like wood and cardboard and sheet metal and combination of just gathered and scavenged materials into these kind of shanty towns where they live because they have nowhere else to go. And you can see an example of one on the slide here. These things were nicknamed Hoovervilles after the President of the United States at the time, Herbert Hoover, who was blamed for the Depression itself. And you can see here the Hooverville in Seattle, which is one of the largest in the country, but they're all over. The other thing that happens during the Depression is that you get more westward migration. People began to flee the eastern industrial cities in which the Depression is so acute, moving west looking for new opportunities, going to places like California Oregon, Washington, trying to find new opportunities. All right, now conditions are just as bad out there, but they're desperate. Another problem that emerges is an ecological disaster that hits the Great Plains and the South just as the Depression is setting in the early 1930s, and that is something called the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl. Now, Dust Bowl is a man-made ecological disaster. It's a man-made ecological disaster. The Dust Bowl was a drought that hit the Great Plains and the South. So what happened was there was a drought, and that drought dried out the soil, and then the soil, once dried out, just blew away, right? Because of an extreme period of wind. So you had drought, lack of rainfall, and then wind blowing away topsoil all throughout all throughout the plains and the South, starting in the 1930s, and it just created like towns that were filled with inches and feet of dirt and dust, and this is what was nicknamed at the time the Dust Bowl. Now, the drought itself and the wind patterns were not man-made; they were just part of an unfortunate confluence of events. But the origins of the dust and why this became such an ecological catastrophe, it was man-made. Farming practices in the plains in the American South during the late 19th, early 20th century had encouraged the erosion of topsoil. What they had done is they'd engaged in clear-cut farming practices that took away the native grasses and vegetation that held down the topsoil, the rich topsoil, the fertile topsoil that was needed to grow crops. And so all it took was a little bit of drought to dry that topsoil up. And once that topsoil was dry, the wind could then blow it away, and it did by the tons. And you can Google images of the Dust Bowl in which some towns are inundated with literally feet and feet of dirt and dust. It's this dried out topsoil that's blown away. When this topsoil left, so too did the fertile soil that had driven the farms of the South and the plains, meaning the farmland couldn't sustain crops, not just to grow for the country, but even subsistence crops. And this meant that these lands in the South and the Great Plains were basically useless. They couldn't be farmed. They couldn't be used for subsistence, and so people left, and they left to the cities, and they left west to find new opportunities. This is known in American history as the Okie migration, after the people from Oklahoma, which is one of the first states that this happened to. But it's people from the plains and the South all over. And they will end up traveling by the hundreds of thousands, abandoning their farms in rural areas because of the Dust Bowl, moving primarily west, looking for farm work or looking for factory work or looking for new opportunities. As I mentioned in the last lecture, and I mentioned at the start of this lecture, the person who became president in 1928, was elected in 1928, was Herbert Hoover, a Republican. And history has not been kind to Herbert Hoover. He is often remembered as the president who both caused the Great Depression and did nothing to address the Great Depression. So he was a president who is remembered for doing too little to address the Great Depression. He's often blamed for causing the Great Depression. This is simply not entirely true, and Hoover is a maligned figure in American history, some of which he clearly has earned and deserves, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but some of which he doesn't. To give you a little bit of background on Herbert Hoover was one of the richest men to ever become president. In fact, before the election of Donald Trump, he probably was the richest man to ever be president of the United States. Herbert Hoover was a self-made millionaire. He had gone to college, become an engineer of sorts, and he had invented some mining technology that was pretty important and pretty revolutionary, and it made himself a lot of money through companies he owned directly. And then because he owned the patents, he sold the patents, or he licensed the use of this mining technology to other groups. And he made a tremendous amount of money. And Herbert Hoover was a traditional Republican whose life experiences convinced him that hard work and a lack of government intervention was what was best for the economy and for individuals. So Herbert Hoover was a laissez-faire capitalist. He did not believe in regulation. He did not believe in unions. He did not believe in government intervention in the economy. He believed that the economy must run on its own. The market must be free to generate innovation and benefits for all. And Hoover was convinced if you worked hard enough and were smart enough that you could benefit from this system, because after all, he had as well. Herbert Hoover was also a massive philanthropist. He gave a lot of money away. He was a massive peace activist. He had engaged in lots of attempts to peacefully bring about an end to World War I, including most famously something called a peace ship, which was this ship that he basically purchased and outfitted and with medical supplies and food and clothing, and tried to get it to go to Europe and tried to use it as a vehicle to bring an end to this conflict. So Herbert Hoover is this traditional Republican who supports corporations and believes in laissez-faire capitalism. He just doesn't see a role for government in the economy. So when the Great Depression hits, Hoover just believes it's part of a natural economic cycle, that it's a quote-unquote correction, that the market was quote-unquote correcting itself. This is what Hoover believes. Hoover believes that the economy the depressions are ultimately good for the economy. They're the medicine for the economy to correct it. So initially, Hoover doesn't really concern himself with the depression. You can Google and look up Herbert Hoover speeches in the early years of the Depression, and most of them are filled with sort of a combination of optimism and tough love. Hoover says things like, he's seen depressions come and go. This one will end. He says things like, we've had dark days, but the economy is correcting itself and rebound is around the corner. He says things like, we just have to steady the course. We just have to endure this, and things will get better. Now, at best, that's a callous message from a wealthy man who isn't suffering the deprivation of the depression, who's not feeling the homelessness, the unemployment, the poverty, the real suffering of the American public that the vast majority of Americans are feeling. The Great Depression was unlike any other economic catastrophe the United States had ever seen or seen since. And this gave Hoover a reputation for callousness. When Hoover did act, he acted in a way that actually made the Depression worse. So the one thing Hoover did engage in was he did support something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff was basically a tariff or a tax on imported goods from abroad. So basically to encourage Americans to buy American goods and thus help American businesses, and by helping American businesses, the theory went you would help American businesses hire American workers, and then American workers would be put back to work, and it would end the economic security. In order to encourage Americans to buy American industries, or from American industries, a tariff was put on goods outside the United States, on goods imported in the United States, and that's what the Smoot-Hawley Tariff is. It's goods, taxes on goods coming into the United States. Now, this is what's called economic protectionism. You're protecting your own industries by taxing other countries' industries to make their goods more expensive and thus make American goods more desirable. In theory, this sounds like it works, but the problem is people who favor tariffs often forget that we live in an interconnected economic world, and American companies want to sell abroad as well as inside the United States. And so what the Smoot-Hawley tariff basically did was it created a tariff war with other places in the world, in which once we place a tariff on other goods, other countries decide to place a tariff on our goods. And so any gains you made in the American market were wiped out by gains you lost in the world market. And so the Smoot-Hawley tariff is universally recognized by economists and historians as actually making things worse. Now in 1930, Republicans lose the House of Representatives dramatically. So in the midterm elections, we say midterm election is when, in the middle of a president's term, the House of Representatives and then a third of the Senate is up for election. And midterms are usually a good gauge of how the public feels about the sitting president. In the 1930 midterm elections, Democrats took over the House of Representatives from the Republicans. It was a historic defeat for Republicans. They lost an enormous number of seats. And Democrats made huge gains in the Senate, and Republicans barely held on. It indicated to Hoover that his ideas and his party were unpopular. And so political pressure was applied to Hoover with the idea of forcing him to do something, lest the Republican Party become have an even worse outcome in the 1932 presidential and congressional elections. So out of this, Herbert Hoover decides that he's going to engage in some new policies. One of the first things he does is he decides that he is going to try and pump some money in the economy through something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was enacted in 1932, was an attempt to use government money to do government programs to help jumpstart the economy. And it authorized about $1.5 billion for public works, most famously Hoover Dam in Nevada on the Colorado River. It was generally seen as a good idea to spend money on the economy to help get it going. The problem is it was too little too late. And it was compounded by the fact that Hoover refused to spend in other ways. Hoover was obsessed with balanced budgets, this idea that the government shouldn't run a budget deficit. So he spent money on the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which funded infrastructure projects, but then he balanced that out by slashing other government programs and other government expenses. Well, when you do that, you're basically wiping out any benefits because the money you're providing to one area is just being taken away from somewhere else. And the way in which Hoover often balanced the budget was by slashing payments to veterans. So World War I veterans were due pensions. And in 1932, they were actually due a raise. Their pension, Congress had voted them a raise in their pensions. And so veterans, many of whom were really unemployed, were really depending on these pension payments to get by. Well, what Hoover did in 1932 is he cut these pension payments. He cut them, and he refused to give them the increase that they were authorized. This made veterans angry, and they marched on Washington and began to camp on Washington to demand their pensions be restored. Hoover then compounded his callousness with one of the worst political mistakes in American history. He sent in the army under Douglas MacArthur to clear out the veterans, and there were photos of this. And so you have photos of veterans who are unemployed, hungry, and starving. Their families are starving, demanding their pensions to be restored, and Hoover is clearing them out with the military. It's not a good political look, in addition to just being the wrong thing to do to people in general. It's a political nightmare. So, in addition to the veteran strike of 1932, there are farmer strikes across the country in which farmers are basically just dumping their crops, their crops and their produce, into public squares and into streets because they can't sell them. And they can't sell them because they can't get a good price. And so they're just letting this food, which people all need, rot. And so people are upset with Herbert Hoover. Now, in addition to being obsessed with balanced budgets to offset his spending in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Hoover tries to distract the public by trying to mobilize public opinion and demonize an immigrant group. This is an age-old play in American politics. When things get bad, you demonize a particular group of people. In this case, Hoover's trying to demonize immigrants. And the immigrants he's targeting are people of Mexican heritage. As we talked about in the last lecture, the 1924 National Origins Act did not restrict any immigration from the Western Hemisphere. And over 1 million immigrants from Mexico had come to work in the United States. Well, now what Hoover does is he targets these groups and demonizes them, effectively blaming them for the unemployment that is happening in the United States, especially in Western states. And so Hoover authorizes immigration officials, the military and border officials, to begin mass deportations of people of Mexican heritage, deporting over 1 million people of Mexican heritage and ancestry, rounding them up, using police and military to do so in very, not just racist, but horrifying and intimidating circumstances. And one of the problems we know of this is that Hoover is basically saying, well, we're rounding up immigrants who are stealing American jobs. That's not true. They're not stealing anyone's jobs. They were here to work, and they can't find work just like anyone else. But two, Hoover is not just deporting immigrants. He's deporting American citizens of Mexican heritage. We know now that there are lots of instances. We don't know the firm number, but we know a significant number of these mass deportations were not immigrants, but were American citizens. A significant number, we don't know how much, but a significant number of this million were American citizens, and they were deported by Hoover simply because they happened to be of Mexican heritage. But they were American citizens. To be clear, the vast majority of people that Hoover is targeting are immigrants. But among this immigrant group are American citizens. And keep in mind, these immigrants have done nothing wrong. They are here legally according to American immigration law at the time. Hoover is just vilifying them, looking for a scapegoat to blame for the economy so that voters don't blame his party in the election of 1932. All right. I thank you for listening. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about the election of 1932 and Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Bye for now.